Hello and welcome to the show, another episode of my summer series. Today I am joined by the fabulous, the wonderful, and hopefully not stoned Nicholas Pearson. Hello, Nicholas Pearson.
Hello, hello. Thanks for having me on the
Hello.
show.
Yes. And I only say that I hope you're not stoned because you recorded an episode with Devin Hunter earlier for your show, Stoned with, or Getting Stoned with Devin and Nicholas. Um, so, for those who may not know who you are, I suspect a lot of people who are watching this will already know who you are. But for those people who maybe in the deep depths of the Celtic sphere might not know who you are, um, you are among the foremost experts on crystals. You're an author and a teacher. Nicholas Pearson combines his extensive background in mineral science with a love of healing, spirituality, and folklore to illustrate the healing properties of gemstones. As an avid Reiki practitioner and shihan, Nicholas is also passionate about understanding the roots of the system of Reiki. An international speaker, Nicholas has taught in both North America and Europe, and other places, I believe, too.
Only
And
virtually so far.
virtually. And he recently returned from a teaching trip to the United Kingdom, where he is an instructor at the College of Psychic Studies, mostly virtually, but sometimes in person, which is based in South Kensington in London. He has been featured on numerous podcasts and radio shows and currently collaborates with Devin Hunter on Getting Stoned with Devin and Nicholas. His published works include his very first book, put out in 2016, The Seven Archetypal Stones, also Flower Essence from the Witch's Garden, Foundations of Reiki Ryoho, and 6 other books on various aspects of crystal healing and magic, including his newest, Crystal Basics, a Pocket Encyclopedia, which just came out a couple of months ago. Welcome to the show, Nicholas.
Well, thank you so much.
Welcome.
I've been looking forward to this conversation. I've enjoyed getting to know you in, the social media sphere, but this is nice.
This is wonderful. I know we're just after Mara Starling, and you were a little concerned that you wouldn't shape up, but already you're shaping up, so it's okay.
Oh, Mara's amazing. I so love her work.
I said that I was talking to her after the show last week, and I was saying you were nervous about coming on after her, and she said, "Oh, I love him so much." And I said, "Well, he wants to have tea with you at some point." She's like, "Oh yes, we'll meet in Glastonbury somewhere."
That sounds like a dream.
I love it. I love it. So, Nicholas, let's start first of all by talking a little bit about your background. So, for those who don't really know who you are, if they're not really connected with crystal healing or Reiki, so tell us a little bit about kind of what your background is and where you come from, why you're so connected to your subjects.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, the short version is that I really like rocks and I'm very much a big old nerd. And when those two spheres intersect, I can't help myself. I just have to learn as much as I can about all these little tangents that kind of yields what I do today. I was the stereotypical kid who picked up rocks everywhere, gravel driveways, grocery store parking lots, the seashore, family trips out of state, and there was no rhyme or reason that anyone could observe. I think even like conscious level, I didn't know why. It had to happen. And the only thing diagnosable about is that I love them. And so my grandfather witnessed this phenomenon over the first few years of my life. And by the time I was 8, he gifted me my first piece of quartz. And this relatively inert part of the landscape was like transfigured in some way. We went from rough faces and blobby shapes to regular angles and transparency and these geometric faces, and it felt like something out of a fairy tale. Like it was very much like holding a piece of a storybook in my hands, so I had to know more. And initially I kind of started with that folkloric part of things. uh,
Mhm.
i I often describe my spiritual persuasion as a feral sort of animism, because I'm lucky and unlucky at the same time. I never really had religion growing up. My dad was raised very, very Catholic, so Catholic, in fact, he didn't pass it on to anyone else. So when other families did, religion on weekends, we went to the library. So some weeks it might be fairy tales and folklore, world religion. I grew up loving mythology, all the kind of classical myths that you can find. And then some weeks it was science. My dad was a man of science. He came from a family with a strong background in medicine. And, you start with age appropriate stuff, reading, the little picture books for geology and marine biology and whatever it might be. But I just read voraciously. And I gradually got into like the grown-up sections of the library to learn about the things that I loved. And I realized pretty early on something that didn't seem out of the ordinary to me, but always seems kind of surprising to grown-ups. And that's like science and spirituality, religion, mythology. They're just two sets of vernacular for describing the same kinds of things. And they ultimately point to the same human impulse, and that's making sense of the world around us. Like, how do we relate to what these phenomena are? Are we looking at them through the metaphorical, symbolic lens, a very relational lens, or are we trying to quantify and qualify all of them? But at the end of the day, it's the same cosmos that we're just trying to explain. And once that kind of took root in my psyche, I had no qualms kind of code switching, if you will, between science and spirituality, depending on where I was. And I'm real lucky that I got to do that kind of work firsthand in the science world, studying earth and environmental science at university. I actually was the preparator and docent for one of the largest rock and mineral collections in the southeastern United States. That was where I had a lot of my early like geological aha moments, so much so that I left my study of music to immerse myself in science, and then I got carried away and did other things instead. But it's been really marvelous getting to keep a foot in each of those realms, straddling that threshold like we do as liminal people in witchy spaces. So rocks have been the forefront of that, but it's certainly not the only thing in my practice. So I love all kinds of folklore and myth and magic.
I was going to say, just having followed you for the past half year or so, a little bit longer than that, what comes through very much on your social media and all the podcast interviews you have, and even your interests that you share on your private Facebook, is that not only the love of music, but the love of flower essences, the love of mineralogy, and I've always been very curious, kind of watching as an outsider looking in on your life. There seems to be a current between all three of them for you, and they seem to all blend in together at times. Has that caused issues for you in the science world when you were first starting to get into the science world?
It, honestly, no. And it's
No.
because at the museum that I worked in on campus, and to make a long story short, I was randomly assigned to work at this earth science museum because I went to my second choice school, and all of the work study assignments related to music and performance were taken up already. So I got the place nobody wanted to be. I had no idea that this Earth Science Museum existed, that it had such a historic collection. So I was in heaven. But my boss's boss there, the curator of the museum, became my academic advisor. And he honestly, I remember him taking me aside one day and saying, I see what you do with rocks outside of this. I think that's great. As long as what we do in these four walls is always science, I'm eager to learn from you. And that's just kind of how we set the tone and the way we kept it. So I also learned early on as a kind of naive late teen, early 20 something, that in very geologically oriented spaces, people don't take kindly to how you feel about a rock. So I use what little fancy geological training I've got to my advantage to just talk science to people who only care about science. And I'm happy that there are so many doorways in to something that I'm passionate about. If someone wants to be really woo, let's be woo. If someone wants history and folklore, let's do that. If you want to talk chemistry, I mean, I'll do more listening than talking, but I can hold my own for a while.
Makes sense. That makes sense. It's curious. I mean, from both sides, kind of, if somebody wants to be woo, if somebody wants to be more scientific, and we were talking briefly beforehand about how since the pandemic, It seems like there's not only the writers are starting to send into publishers a lot more serious work, but Mara and I was talking about this last week. There seems to be a shift just generally in the market that we're both in. People are more interested in not just the woo, but also the scientific, the historical, the all of it. There seems to be a real craving for more serious work. Are you finding that too in your classes? Of course, you run a lot of classes online. What have you noticed about that?
Trends come and go, and I've always just kind of staked my claim on attracting my audience, whoever that's going to be. Sometimes it's 5 people in a class, and that's sad when sometimes it's like 75 people.
Yeah.
But I think when when we're in this kind of space, whatever our specific area of expertise is going to be, if we do that pretty darn authentically, people catch on, and very subversively. If people don't fall in love with me for my scientific knowledge, I still ensure that they learn a little bit of earth science. They're going to learn some geology, a little bit of mineral chemistry, just a touch of crystallography. And I'm in real life settings, I'm pretty good about talking and stopping before the eyes glaze over.
Mhm.
Sometimes that's saying, this is rhodonite. It is a manganese silicate with small amounts of essential calcium, and you've already lost them. So then we've got to like find that natural sinewy route that kind of bends and twists through what they anticipate and what I endeavor to teach them.
Mhm.
So I try to respond as much in the moment, but definitely in 2020 there was a massive surge of interest in all things spiritual, especially when it came to integrative medicine and wellness, which is a big part of what I do, but I'm real careful to stay in my own lane on that. And I think people just felt and continue to feel relatively disempowered. So all things magical are empowering, right? It's using our will to exert change, to maybe collaborate with the world around us to effect change might be a better way, a more animistic way to think of it.
I really like that. I really like that. Collaborate. Yeah. I had another question and it's gone completely out of my mind, so it'll come back to me. But I was just thinking about that idea of trends come and go. Now, I mean, you've been now writing for almost 8 years. It was 2016 when your first one came out, and you've had quite a meteoric rise. You were telling me beforehand that you accomplished 3 projects within a year of you, within that year of putting out your first. And then ever since then, you've been putting out more and more content. You've been teaching a lot. Um, what has that journey been like for you? 8 years is a short period, but it's also a massive period too, right?
It's really surreal. If I can be just totally transparent and frank,
Please do.
um, when when the most recent book came out, the Pocket Encyclopedia, arguably the smallest of my works in trim size and
Mhm.
word count and everything, the size of the pictures, it's all kind of microscopic, but um, I had to like pack up for an event, an in-person one, and I like pulled out boxes of all my books and just like saw them for the first time, and it was like, this is crazy. This is like the sheer volume of work that has happened. And as you know, the real work actually begins when you've finished writing the book. It
Absolutely.
doesn't get hard until after that part. That is the easiest and most enjoyable part of that process. No matter how you feel about it, I promise you, it's still the easiest part. And I I'd wanted to be a writer for a long time. I actually started writing my first book 19 years ago, and that will never see the light of day. That project doesn't speak to me anymore. I'm not invested in it. Some of the
Slash fiction, wasn't it? It was slash fiction, wasn't it?
it was still about rocks, I promise you that, but it was gonna be like the encyclopedia of all encyclopedias. And you know what? Other people did that. Other people did it sooner. Other people did it with resources that I probably won't ever have. I'm so not interested in that. I'm interested in my own view, my own perspective, but I can't tell you how many other projects I started and stopped in that time. And it was like I talked about wanting to write and becoming a writer, and I think it got so bad that it was totally one of those like, sure, Nicholas kind of moments every time it came up in conversation. And then I just finished a book. I started a book and I finished it. And I thought, oh, well, let's just do this again. So I did a few times over now, and it was like the floodgates opened. And I'm still not really sure where it all comes from. Like I know my process is intensive. There's a reason all these books are behind me and
Absolutely.
off camera.
Mhm.
It's very research heavy. It's also filled with the Nicholas perspective. I never just regurgitate what someone else says, even though that's kind of the standard in crystal literature, to be honest. Um, but I love finding a new angle, finding a new perspective, and then just digging through until I've got enough to put together. And that's just what I keep doing over and over again, finding something that I don't think has been done or hasn't been done effectively. Or, sometimes you're just standing in the shower, shampooing your hair. That's what the flower essence book came to me. It's like,
Right.
oh, I do weird things with essences. I shall write a book on that. What am I going to call it? And then it just came out.
Just came out.
Um, yeah.
A very animistic process too. It's almost like the idea is birthed into you, right?
Yes. In fact, a long time ago, a friend and mentor of mine, Marilyn Twintrees, she and her husband, Thomas, have written a series of books called Stones Alive. She told me years ago when I was just kind of really finishing my first manuscript, it wasn't even done, and I was coming up with new ideas. Never actually carried out most of those other ideas. Um, but I was trying to tell her about how I'm having trouble sticking with it when there's so many others. She's like, Nicholas, pretend it's a deli counter. Ask them to wait in line and take a number. And whenever someone comes up, just ask them where if they're the next in line, and I'll tell you. When I when I actually completed my second manuscript, I'd been working on something else, and I just had this idea. It's like, oh, that's not what we're working on. And finally, I took her advice and I just spoke to the spirit of the book, and I said, okay, I promise I see you, I pay attention to you. You just have to wait your turn in line. And I just got this visual of this, amorphous spirit just kind of holding up a ticket at the deli counter saying, well, actually, we switched numbers. I'm next. And 4 weeks later, I had a manuscript.
4 weeks.
Yeah,
Wow.
I don't promise it was a very good manuscript, but it was a draft, start to finish. Um,
That's incredible. I love that image. It's funny now that I'm in this phase of my process, right? And I'm starting to work on my second, and I had a third one that was kind of lingering, and it was really like touch and go which one was going to be actually written and focused on, and it felt like that. It definitely felt like having that. Those it was almost like Spirited Away, no face, waiting, you know.
yes.
It was very interesting, I feel like any creative people have that problem where we're the receptacle for something else, and then it comes through us, you know. Hmm. So now I'm curious. Out of all of your work so far, which one has been the most satisfying to write? Kind of start from finish.
Oh, the most satisfying to write. That's a good question. Um, that's not how most people try to frame this question. So, um, I think if I'm gonna pick one, I'm probably gonna pick my Reiki book because of the level of notation and citation and just the I'm not in academia. I left academia behind, but it didn't leave me behind. So I tried to be as scholarly as possible while still capturing the zeitgeist, trying to capture what's really
Mhm.
happening in the Reiki community. So that one was a special kind of project, a real labor of love, but one that I thoroughly enjoy. I hope to revise it and expand it for future editions at some point. I have a sequel that hopefully I'll start in the
Oh,
next year or
excellent.
two. But that was definitely satisfying.
That was satisfying, wonderful. So, of course, the question then is, what was the most frustrating? Not disappointing. We're not going to use that word, but what was most frustrating?
It's the one in progress now. Um, I misjudged how long it's been in progress. I was rooting around my desk for other things, and I found a notebook in it. And I opened it up to see if there were class notes from a class I took because I wanted to compare to one I'm enrolled in now. And wouldn't you know, from very early 2019, I found notes for the manuscript I still have in progress in mid 2023. Now I've finished other books 3 books have come out since I started writing this one, but I would really love to just be done with it.
Yeah.
And I mean that in the most loving
Yes.
and kind way that I can, but like it's time.
I love it. It's almost like speaking like a child. I feel the same way with mine. I'm like, people ask me now, "Oh, you must be so exciting that it's coming out." And I'm like, "Yeah, yeah, I need it to get out of a spare bedroom and stop, and start paying rent and go to university. I'm ready for it to leave home.
Oh yeah.
But it's funny. What do you? I mean, I don't want to ask too many questions about it because it's still an unfinished piece. But what do you think is for your process, anyways? What's the frustrating bit about it? What's the halt with it?
There's a long laundry list of things that I could talk about, but
Mm,
the most poignant, the most real is that just life keeps getting in the
yeah.
way. Teaching online is a different beast than teaching in person. It used to
Mhm,
be I could, write copy for a class, send it in, and just drive there with a box of rocks and teach, and it was fine. But now I have to make sure that I don't have overlapping curriculum in 2 different
right.
places, because when it's online, anybody can join from around the world. I have to make them unique and different, and we've got to have a different set of visual aids. I can't put a rock in someone's hand, which is not satisfying when you're teaching about rocks or flowers or whatever it might be. So I try to accommodate different learning styles, and that means it's labor intensive.
Mhm,
And I'm grateful for how busy it's kept me, but the amount of effort that goes into some of this curriculum planning is actually more intensive than it takes to outline a book and draft a proposal. And there are months where I have done upwards of 6 of these events in a single month. So
oh,
I'm there hasn't been bandwidth left over for writing, and
mhm.
that's been part of it. And then the other part is now I'm in my 4th year working on this, and I'm admittedly a little bored.
Yeah, I feel that. I feel that. Especially when you have so many other more dynamic things perhaps going on, some of the changes of the curriculums you were just saying about, um, and of course traveling too. I mean, during the pandemic, nobody could travel. Now we were actually able to go back and forth, and well, some of us, anyways, and you're actually able to go and teach in person again. So let me ask you about that then, because I feel like a lot of people probably know you if they're all around the world from online. They may not have come down to Florida or to the UK where you teach. What is that? What is that? What was that going back to in-person events like after the pandemic for you? And what did you notice shifted for your teaching style?
Hmm, that's a really good question. So, um, I started very small. I took baby steps, and I did a couple of small local events. Spoke at a university. We were socially distanced and masked and doing the whole thing. And I gradually got to the point where I was actually getting on a plane for small in-person events, weekend-long intensives, so they could be intimate and still kind of separate from the rest of the world. But one of the things that I notice is that I've spent all these years learning, studying.
And,
Since the start of the pandemic, I initially I had more time to invest in learning and personal practice, and now I come back to topics that I haven't touched since before the pandemic, and I have a lot more to say on them. So time management is the big problem. um, I want to keep talking, and then we run out of time to do things because all we've done is talk about them. So that's one of my personal shifts. But then when it also comes to um, like the relational, the communal part of it, I'm seeing so many fresh faces, and I'm seeing certainly people who know and love my work and have for a while. But there are a lot of people who are coming to magical, witchy, metaphysical, integrated medicine, wellness kind of spheres that haven't really been spending a lot of time in them before. And it's really exciting to me that um, it is opening doors for people to go outside of the status quo and maybe feel like they have some sense of agency in life. And if I can support them in any way for that, that's wonderful. And if I can't, hopefully I can point them to someone who can do it better than me.
Absolutely, absolutely. And let's be honest here, you are very well connected. Like of the little time I've known you, already I see how many connections you have, not just networking connections, but more intimate, friendly connections, right? Um, you were just talking about kind of coming from personal experience and personal practice and moving into then teaching. What has that been like for you to start to collaborate with other practitioners? Obviously, you do the podcast with Devin, who is also grounded in working with crystals and rocks and minerals. What has that been like for you as part of your kind of rise to power?
Oh, I have been teaching now for this May marks 19 years.
Mm,
So I started really before people should have been paying money to listen to me talk. Like I knew a lot about rocks, but I didn't know a lot about life back then.
right.
Um, so I'd say that's a little different now. I know even more about rocks, but I certainly have had some real lived experience, and
Mhm.
I can at least pass for a grown up. Maybe not always under scrutiny, but I think that's true for most of us. Um, so the joy of the last few years especially has been collaborating. um I love to get to know other people. I was really precocious in college, and I would just write to authors whose works that I liked, kind of sticking to the crystal world because that was my main shtick, if you will, for a good long while. But I like to do and read and practice and learn a lot of different things. And the beautiful thing for the past 3 years is the increasing availability of online space for learning, for cultivating relationship. And it's not just social media. Like I can take classes, even if they're pre-recorded. I can get to know people's work in ways that I've never been able to. And out of that is born the opportunity sometimes to collaborate. And my very best friend in the world currently is one of those like pandemic friendships. We'd known each other for years. We actually met the same weekend in 2014 that I met my publisher
Oh, wow.
event, and we just were casual acquaintances for all those years. But post spring of 2020, we live and work in similar kinds of environments
Mm,
in different parts of the country, and that's led to some brilliant collaborations. That's Ashley Levy is who I'm talking about, founder of the Love and Light School of Crystal Therapy, and she's the one that I went to the UK with to teach alongside and to develop this week-long retreat with. And I got to teach alongside Devin last
mm,
fall, and now that I'm actually going to conferences and stuff again, I get to learn and sit and talk to all these brilliant people whose books are on my shelves. And um, yeah, it's great. The thing about collaboration is often when teaching, I learn a lot from what students bring to the table, and there's always something meaningful that I take away from that experience. Also, sometimes I surprise myself. Something falls out of my mouth that I didn't even know about, because we are sometimes just the mouthpieces. It's
it's
not
true.
really us.
Yeah.
Um, but to see other people do that is so wonderful. Like when Ashley and I were in Glastonbury, and she was so in her element, talking about apple magic, I think was like the pinnacle of her like nerdiness meets her spiritual practice meets like the intelligence of that space that we were in. It has its own many layers of reality and Chalice Well. Just seeing her was so magical. And then we got to teach together and do stuff together and collaborate. And I love it because I mean, as a Capricorn, I love the idea that maybe not all the responsibility is on me, especially if I pick people who are gonna pull their weight. And then I get to do what I do even better,
Mm,
and they get to do what they do even better because we're building this scaffolding of support underneath us. And I've had a lot of brilliant people invest
mm,
time and energy into my career, from all levels, readers, people recommending books to friends, mentors, teachers, people I look up to who've written blurbs or
right.
um, whatever it might be. So I try to pay that forward. So if it's not even
Mm,
just strict collaboration, it's rare that I get asked to do an endorsement and I outright just say no. And it's almost always because I just don't have time, because
absolutely.
I want to be able to do for other people what has happened to me.
Mm,
And um, Yeah, we live in such a relational time frame, and the virtual space, I think, has actually augmented that in spite of what could be said from time to time.
It's true. It's true. When I started to really put myself out there about 4 or 5 months ago, because of the phase of my project, it was amazing. It really struck me how incredible some of the people I was connecting with was. And I was starstruck with quite a few of them until, of course, the layers came down and I could just see them as equals again, right? As a Virgo, it's much more difficult for me to see, collaboration and whatnot as a thing, right? But but it's fascinating how the switch works. Now I'm looking at other people and I'm seeing the potential, and I'm saying, when is your book coming out? When are you teaching a class? All of this, and suddenly there's potential there, right? It's fascinating how being in the opposite side of the bridge um, changes your perspective. It sounds like for you, you were connecting with so many different people and you were surrounded by so many people who were supporting you that you made that switch quite early on.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I've just always been interested in the community aspect. Like, no book is written in a vacuum. My my special talent, like if I don't let anyone in on a big secret, like the thing that I think I excel at isn't just rote memorization. It isn't, the woo part of it. It's seeing patterns. So when it comes to these two bookshelves behind me and then some piles off camera, those are just my books on rocks.
Right.
If we like pan, we can take a look and see that it goes on. There are lots of other topics, but when I went through those as a teenager, as an early 20 something in college, I started to notice, oh wow, the language around these books, or the language around these same crystals in different books, is very similar. Oh, so and so is a student of so and so. Oh, this book is in that book's bibliography. Oh, these are exactly the same words, but it doesn't appear as a quote or in a bibliography. That sounds like a problem. So I've always been interested in how ideas influence one another. Um, Raven Grimassi used to talk about like the inertia of tradition. Like there's a kind of groove that is built into things, and it's far easier to flow along that groove than to go outside of it or upstream. And you can do those things.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, we need people to. We need to build new grooves. We got to dig out new canals that this flow of ideas can pass through. But why not harness that? So I've always kind of taken that approach in my writing. All of my books are a product of all the things that I've learned and the people I've known who've inspired me, and the works that I've read. So I do my best to, have all the endnotes and footnotes and citations and bibliographies that show that, but then also to turn around and when someone else needs that support, say, oh, you know what? I know exactly where to find that. Or, hey, I figured this out. Why don't I just help you? And um, I don't I don't think that as we're in, late stage dying throes of capitalism, uh, a competitive mindset is going to serve anyone in a field like this. It shouldn't anyway. Um, but coming back to this feral animism, everything is inspirited. We are in relationship with those spirits, whether we're consciousness of it, whether we are conscious of it or not. And it's the same with human beings. We're in relationship with one another. We just don't always feed them the right way. We don't always acknowledge them in meaningful ways. So if I can do that, I will. Maybe that's on an Instagram live. Maybe that's in a class. Maybe it's saying to a colleague, "Oh my God, I just saw the title of your new book. Do you need endorsers?" Um, whatever it might be. If I've got the space, I do my best to show up.
A piece about relationship and being in a relationship, whether it be with people or spirit or whatever, is it really comes through, especially when you're teaching. Of all what I've seen through Instagram lives, I've noticed that you're very particular in noticing who is showing up again and again and again to your feeds. I think that's something that is very Inspiring. I'll be honest. I'm a little starstruck right now, Nicholas. Honestly, because whenever I see you talk, I know whenever like with Mara and some of my other friends, I'm like we're all sensitive, like insecure, and we're just, just working off each other insecurity. But I do find like you are very particular in naming people and noticing who comes up and that poise, and that's been very inspiring for me. I'll be honest with you. Um, and I'm not sure why I need to tell you that right now, except that it's that piece about relationship, right? And I hope that I hope that I can support others in the same way you've supported me, and I really want to just appreciate that for a second. I really appreciate that. I also realize we actually have a very shared connection too, because you have a very, talking about relationships with spirit and that interconnection, you have a very unique relationship with the UK. We've talked about this privately, and so I'd like to ask you about that, because I know last time you went over there it wasn't as fun as you had hoped it would be, but generally your relationship is quite special. Can you tell us a little bit about that relationship?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I don't think I can put a finger on the moment when this started because it was just so gradual.
Mm.
Um, but in 2019, I had my first chance to go over to the UK as a guest presenter, as a co-facilitator of a
It was only
retreat.
2019.
Yeah. Um, and it was again at Chalice Well in Glastonbury, which
Mhm.
is my home away from home, I guess.
Yeah.
And my dear friends who run a retreat organization called Chalice and Time, it's Karen Ainsworth and Dan Lupacino. They brought me in to be like their beta test. We were collaborating on the very first of the retreats they ever ran, and it was my first chance to go over there. And I booked a bunch of events in London on my way in, and I have a habit, no matter where I go, of trying to learn a little bit about what's underneath my feet, like what geology is present. And that's helpful in an energetic sense. If I'm going to be teaching in a space, underneath my feet right now in Central Florida is limestone and water. There's not much else. I mean, you might find a little bit here or there, but it's limestone and water, in some places also phosphates, but it's not like, in Glastonbury, which also has a remarkable amount of limestone, but other things going on. Or when I'm
Mm.
in the up north, and it's the lithologies are, igneous rocks. So getting to understand that gives me some idea of what's happening in the energy beneath my feet, so I can be in that space since we're already communicating with the mineral kingdom. But I had an idea for this retreat to teach about the stones of the landscape. There's some really iconic British rocks. I'll track some down and we'll do a workshop on them. And then when I was over there, I bought a lot more British rocks, like way, way more. And over the years, there's this thing they call the Glastonbury effect. Like when you're there in the magic and the weirdness, you have to like kind of suspend disbelief, and some of that like rubs off on you. And there's this inertia. You go back to real life, and nothing is ever normal again. When you spend enough time there. And there are other places like this, but Glastonbury is really quite special. And um, I kept going with it. My soon-to-be bestie, Ashley Levy, was in Glastonbury just a couple weeks after me. And so she got to live vicariously through my trip before she went, and I got to extend mine vicariously through her trip when she was there right afterwards. And that was one of like our bonding moments. So we decided to really take our mutual love and apply that towards an event, which we finally made happen. We finally pulled it off in spring of this year. But in the ensuing years, I've really taken to want to learn more about the relationship with landscape rather than mineral substance extracted from the landscape. How does the mythic landscape, echo the psychological landscape of the rituals we enact, the dramas that we play out, of the lives that we live? How is the physical structure of that enmeshed in these things? So there is incredible mineral diversity throughout Great Britain and the surrounding areas. We'll say through the Anglo-Celtic lands, because that encompasses isles that are not truly British, but are geologically related. And and seeing the rich diversity. And then there's a long history of mineral collecting.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You know, geology sure didn't start here in Central Florida as relatively young, but it still didn't happen here. But when you go to places like the Museum of Natural History in London, or the one in Oxford, or
Yes.
museums of mining, and this is an epicenter of learning for this. And
Mm.
being so close to where the kind of early days of geology came out, but then also seeing like this is the place where people built stone monuments
Mhm.
since before recorded
Right.
history.
Right.
And
Exactly.
we have an unbroken lineage of continuing to honor those. Maybe not in the same way. I'm definitely not going to propose that every single new ager who steps foot on, the Avebury ritual complex grounds is doing exactly what people did in the Neolithic. It's definitely not that, but um, there are echoes that are shared there, and we don't need fancy, expensive, gorgeous museum quality mineral
Yeah.
specimens to do that kind of magic. The more I spend time in these spaces, magical, mineralogical, in other words, the more I'm inclined to actually encourage people to maybe take a deeper look at what's already around them.
Mhm.
And in herbalism, it's not just trendy, it's just part of the practice now to look at what's growing in your backyard, to look at
Absolutely.
your bioregion and see what is medicinal or therapeutic or maybe spiritually
Mm.
oriented, already there in your landscape. I'm not seeing nearly the same effect in the crystal healing world or in the stone magic world, except among folklore practitioners
I was gonna
whose
say, yeah,
whose tools are basically, flint, white
yeah.
quartz pebbles, the
What we
alkaline
find, right?
stone.
Yeah, yeah.
They don't go much deeper than that, but there actually are traditions that are so much more nuanced. So I'm really endeavoring to get people in touch with what's in their backyard, because it's there, it's present, it's influencing their lives whether or not they go and pick it up, because it's the strata beneath their feet. And then the other part of that is trying to, and it's just at the beginning of trying for me. I've got a long way to go, but trying to have a more decolonial view of lapidary medicine, because so much
Mhm.
of the trend is market based, is consumerized. You want the best crystal healing toolbox, you got to spend the most amount of money. You want the most diverse toolbox, you got to buy the most things. And there's a problem with this, because the earliest evidence that we got of using, we'll say, geological materials, to be as broad as I can, for therapeutic and thaumaturgic reasons, um, is starting with what you've got access to. Yes, the precious gem trade has been around for a long time. Precious gems weren't in the hands of the ordinary people, unless they could go pick them up themselves out of
Mhm.
the earth. And it's always been common stone and the semi-precious, the sort of humbler gems that have been the primary part of human history for a long time, until we start to see better mining technology. So why not invert the current narrative? Why not tell people how amazing chalk and granite and slate and marl are, so that way they don't feel obligated to go out and buy that $2,000 perfect emerald, or
Absolutely.
the $400 jumbo smoky quartz that can grace their altar. Maybe by just communing with the spirits that are there and getting to know their material bodies as well, we can affect really profound change. And that's bringing it right back to home. So for whatever reason, the place where that catalyzed that whole realm of thought for me was the UK. And so I really freaking love British rocks. I wear them around my wrist, around my neck. I have them on my desk at all times. They're often in my pockets. Yeah, I feel like some part of my soul knows the bones of that landscape.
It's interesting because knowing a little bit about your personal life, your husband, of course, comes from the very top end of Appalachia and the Catskills there in New York, right? And that whole like people that I don't think either people on either coast understand how the mountain ranges in Scotland and Wales and Hibernia and North America here are the same. Like the Appalachians go all the way up into Scandinavia when you really look at the history of them, right? And I'm definitely noticing that trend too. Folkloric witches and folkloric practitioners are getting it. But when you look at the more, I don't want to say woo-woo because that's dismissive, but the more new age practitioners, there we go, more new age practitioners, I think they've been conned into thinking that the more exotic something is, the better it is, and you can see the marketplace really going into that. A few years ago, about 7 years ago, I was vending at psychic fairs, and I was buying a lot of material from Kambat in India because that was the cheapest places until I really educated myself on the issues with that, right? But you look at what a lot of those Kambat jewelry sellers or jewel sellers are selling, and it's all the same thing, all the same material: agate, semi-precious stones, agate, all of those, right? And so I'm curious, what needs to happen for the New Age community, the witchcraft community, to start to focus more on what's literally beneath our feet? What do you think needs to happen?
Well, I mean, education is the biggest part of it.
Mm,
And I think it needs to be education without guilt. My mission when I talk about trying to decolonize crystal healing or discussing the ethical ramifications, the
right.
social, environmental, and otherwise ethical implications of mining and extraction, my goal is never to make someone feel bad for the tools that are in their toolbox and how they got to them. Like, you
Mm,
have the tools you've got, let's use them effectively. When
mm,
we know better, we do better. So, like,
mm,
let's start to make incremental change. Um, so, part of that is as guilt-free of an education as I can manage. I think the other part of it is like understanding that when you pick up, I'm going to pick up a little piece of lightly metamorphosed dolerite right here. So
mm,
it's an igneous rock. It underwent some minor alteration over, a low heat, higher pressure kind of event over a long period of time. If you found this on the side of the road, you would go, it's a piece of gravel, and you'd toss it. But this particular piece of dolerite comes from a place that has a sexy story, and so we can exoticize it and fetishize it and use trade names and things. This is actually one of the materials used in the building of Stonehenge. It's also used in the construction of like dozens of other megaliths that nobody ever wants to talk about. This comes from Wales, your not so ancestral homeland, like your actual
Pacelli.
home. Yeah.
Yes.
So it's from Mynydde Preseli
Mhm.
in Pembrokeshire. And if I'm butchering any of the Welsh, I'm so sorry.
I
Um,
don't speak Welsh, so if you butcher it, we'll have Mara on the phone later on, and she'll be like shouting down
yeah,
the,
she, at
in
Nicholas.
Welsh.
Yeah. So this is fancy igneous rock. So people like that it's exotic, but a big part of what makes it exciting is its geologic story. Most of its history is pre-human history. And
Absolutely.
that's true for just about all the rocks you're ever going to find, unless we made them ourselves or unless they happened recently, which does take place.
Mhm.
But most of the rocks people are going to encounter are really old. And if we start to think about the processes that got that beautiful piece of amethyst to form in the earth, and we start to understand the matrix in which it formed, the scoriaceous basalt that had this empty pocket that the silica-rich lava or fluid could kind of reach into and begin to crystallize, we start to see that this process is really poetic. It mirrors certain processes in our own lives. And so we can have a takeaway from that. And if we can do that with a beautiful gem like amethyst, we can do it with that hunk of green schist that we found on the hiking trail. We can do it with a beautiful piece of marble that came from the foothills. We can do it with the lowly pebbles that came out of our rivers. They all have the same kinds of stories. And honestly, rocks tend to tell far more complex stories than single minerals because
Absolutely.
it comes back to this idea of they're communal. Like, you know, we haven't really broached it because we've been more process oriented rather than product oriented, but mineral versus rock. Minerals are naturally occurring inorganic crystals. Their makeups are their constituents are made up of like the periodic table. Rocks are aggregates of one or more minerals. So they're made up of things that are made up of other things. So they are a community. And working with a single mineral, here's quartz variety, smoky citrine from the Congo. It's a very unified substance. When I pick up this dolerite, it's a lot of substances. Actually, this particular dolerite is quite complex. It could be like 20 or more minerals in any given specimen.
I
So
didn't
it's like
realize.
having
No.
a soloist versus a choir.
Hmm.
They're both wonderful. I play the French horn.
I was going
I
to
love
say.
a good horn solo. I Please let it stand out. But isn't it great in a brass choir? Isn't it wonderful as part of, an old school military band? Isn't it like the heart and soul of the orchestra? Doesn't it fit better or fit well, we'll say, not better or worse, but doesn't it fit well in community? And when we start to think about rocks in that way, instead of having to just fetishize the ones that come from far away, and then we've got this very colonial attitude of exoticizing things, we start to notice that it comes down to relationship. What is my relationship with this stone? And then where it comes from is really secondary. Whether you bought it, whether you found it, whether it was given to you, whether it cost you $4,000 or it was a freebie while you were, digging up your garden bed to put in the new annuals.
That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. And it's funny because I maybe from you, I might have heard it from you or somebody else. I definitely have heard it, but somebody once expressed how mineralogical development is like song. When you look at how the earth, through pressure and fire and really vibrant drama, creates the landscape, and those minglings. Uh, and you're right, it comes down to relationship. I think it took me a very long time to get to see them in that way. I was never a rock or mineral person myself. And then I moved to Ontario and I started getting into Ontario kind of landscape, looking at the landscape and paying attention to the energies of the landscape, how different regions of Ontario had that different energy. We're on the Canadian Shield, which is very, very, very ancient, very old, very tired, full of quartz and whatnot. But not quite like the Rockies, which is another place I've been to. Very vibrant, very teenage-like, right? So now I'm curious then, because when we take that a step further with plants and flowers, built from the ground that they're constructed out of, right? What is your relationship like with flowers and flower essences in that similar vein of relationship? Is it different? Is it the same? What kind of relationship do you have?
Where it
That makes
stands right
sense.
now, getting to this place is a long story, but
Okay.
where I am right now, picking up a bottle of a flower essence, like here's some bunchberry essence
Mhm.
made in Alaska. This is not just a bottle of inert liquid that's going to make me feel better. This is a almost like holographic dosage of that plant spirit. Um, Wherever I am in the world, I connect to the bunchberry plant spirit if I've got this with me, or white chestnut or mandrake or whatever it might be. And I think of them very much as spirit medicines. It's not, there are so many ways we can rationalize, we can conceive of the therapeutic mechanisms at play. Well-designed studies that actually adhere to the principles of flower essence therapy demonstrate that repeatedly they perform better than placebos. So we know there's something to it. It's one of those things where like the scientists sometimes pull their hairs out because it's an effect in search of a cause. They don't understand the cause. They can just measure the effect.
Right.
So what if the cause really isn't in that bottle? What if the cause is the plant spirit?
I
I
see.
think there are other models we can look at that give us something that is a little bit more physical. We can talk about
Mm,
things like hydrogen bonds in water and
mm,
clustered water versus bulk water, or structured water versus bulk water. We can do all these kinds of things. We can talk about the role of structured water in
mm,
uh, human cells, and that's all well and good. But flower essences aren't physical therapies. They're
mm.
happening in very, very subtle ways. And I think of it, I often describe the way they work as like tuning forks.
Right.
As a musician, when you want to tune, you've got a tuner, you listen to a drone, someone else plays a pitch, and you try to match it. You don't hear the pitch and magically you're in tune. You have to work at it. So when we have a dose of that plant spirit medicine, it's like hearing that flower's song. And we learn how to come into harmony with it. We sometimes see where we're really out of tune, and it feels more uncomfortable to shine the light on that. And so it sometimes feels like things get worse before they get better, but it's all part of that process. So, um, my work with essences superficially in certain communities and certain spaces has that, rigor, that kind of therapeutic cap that you wear so you can speak a language that makes people comfortable. If I go and start talking about the souls of plants to medically oriented folks, I might just get a few raised eyebrows. I might. And yet, somehow we manage to always talk about plant spirits in every space. So we just gotta, it's the same thing I do with science with the woo woo folks. I go until their eyes glaze over and I stop and I reroute. And we get there little by little. And I think I do the opposite of that with my more scientifically minded and medically minded crowds. We start with science, and then, before we know it, we're dancing naked under the moon together.
I love it. It's funny because have you read Breeding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer?
It is so high on my to read list. I just haven't gotten there yet.
The first chapter, she talks about how, as an indigenous minded, well, and as an indigenous woman, a young indigenous woman wanting to go and study botany, and they ask her, why do you want to study botany? And she said, I want to learn more about the stories of the plants. And they say, what? It is that dance, right, between kind of the different lenses that we use to see them, right? But I think that the two complement each other. They're saying the same thing just in different language, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah. So here's a question for you. This is more of a selfish question, but I'm curious because the way you described how you work with minerals versus rocks, seeing rocks as communities and appreciating them as communities and working relationships, versus then plant spirits. You seem to work with them more singularly, and so I'm curious in working with particular populations of plants. And the reason I'm asking this is when you look at fairy mythology, you look at certain parts of the UK or certain parts of Ireland, and certainly those areas that have a lot more calcium in the ground, they produce the best they produce the best grazing material plants that then when the cows eat it all up, create the best milk, and those cows are often then seen as fairy cattle because their milk is just the most luscious, the most creamiest, most calcium rich, right? So when working with different populations of plants and flowers, say invasive species in North America that are indigenous to Europe, for example, those histories. Do you tend to see differences in then how you relate to those different populations, or are the spirits all the same? If that makes any sense at all.
It does. It does. There are layers to this,
Mm,
and I want to start with just a little PSA that, especially in plant spirit world, whether it's the kind of neo core shamanic type or more occult spaces, we often use very similar terms, and we don't always use them the same way. So, but before I give you a real answer, I just want to say, don't get hung up on the exact words I'm using. Let's look at the pictures they're painting, just in case your terminology differs. And I find that plants being biologically living things. Rocks are not biologically alive. Some of them are the byproduct of biological life, and that's a whole other complicated story. But they don't live and breathe in the same way that plants do, or animals, or microorganisms, or anything else. So, but plants being alive and having a breath through transpiration, having a metabolism, um, drinking up water and metabolizing nutrients, we relate to them in very different ways, and we sense that life and consciousness in different ways. And it's still very different to our own, very, very different. However, it opens a door to a different kind of communication. I find a lot of people in occult spaces who have really strong connections to plant spirits and use crystals for nothing more than materia magica. Like, this is an
that
inert
makes
substance I'm
sense.
putting in a spell pouch or a jar or whatever else it's going to be, because they speak such different languages.
Mm,
Um, but with plant spirits, it becomes so apparent how multifaceted their souls are. So
Mm,
I like to think of it as, and I'm going to kind of sample from different terminologies here, but we have a kind of like oversoul, which is sometimes described as the deva of a plant. It's the blueprint for the whole species. It is the architect who draws up the blueprint. And then,
mm,
we have other kinds of spirits, and different people are going to call them different kinds of things. But these other spirits kind of draw together the spiritual matter as well as the physical matter required to to build something according to that blueprint. And then we have other things that take those raw materials and do the construction of it. And
mm,
then we've got whoever moves into that home, right? The actual soul of that individual plant. So we've got our architect, we have our materials providers, our builders. Not a single one of those is more important than another. If you want a house, you got to have the architect, you got to have the raw materials, you got to have people who put it all together according to those
absolutely.
plans. So we can't rank them in an order of importance. We
Mm,
only rank them according to the job they perform. But part of this equation is also like, where are we building? Who's in charge of that land? Who's got the landowning rights? If we want to use this kind of analogy, which is sadly a very colonial one. But then we have to draw into this conversation the spirit of the land itself, which is made up of animal, vegetable, mineral, other resources, other kinds of spirits that maybe aren't tethered to physical bodies. So plants have to be in communion with all of these because they respond in real time in biological ways. They also respond in real time in other ways that we might not see with our eyes, but we can feel with our hearts. So when we get to know any given plant and we're talking to its spirit, imbibing its physical or spiritual medicine in a way that is safe and appropriate, we are experiencing the benefit from all of this at once. And yeah, a common conversation we have in the flower essence world, because it's a spirit-based therapy, it is a vibrational remedy and not a chemical one, is why is it that so many different flower essence producers describe the same plant in different words or as doing different things? And it's because there's an oversoul that's the architect of all of them. And we've got the same raw materials and builders going into it, but it's in different places. The spirit of place is influencing that relationship. The individuated soul of the plant you collected flowers from is a part of that. I grow a lot of daturas in my garden, and even if I have the same species, I have known some datura stramonium that is coy and gentle and playful and puts out lots of flowers, and I have others that they can't be bothered. Like
right.
seriously, like I'm gonna do my thing. Don't pay attention to me.
Right.
And sure, there could be soil geology and soil chemistry factors that are involved in it, but I think it's also a spirit thing, just like
I
with
see.
people. We're all
Mm,
fundamentally the same, and yet we're all totally different. Both things can be true at the same time. So when it comes to my approaching relationships with individual populations of plants, the spirit of the landscape kind of leads that.
mm,
And there are certain kinds of plants that are communities unto themselves. Um, you'd be really hard pressed to find a tree in an old growth forest of any age, whatever that tree is within it, that isn't connected to all the other trees, that isn't deeply
absolutely.
rooted in the soil, that isn't home to maybe thousands of other small critters.
Hmm.
So when we're getting to know that plant spirit, it's the oversoul, it's the
Mm,
nature spirits and builders, it's the inhabitant of that one tree, it's all the organisms in and around it, it's the land drawn through it. So yeah, you have to treat everything paradoxically as exactly the same and completely different. There's
absolutely.
only one of us here, and yet we're having myriad experiences.
Totally. That totally makes sense. That totally makes sense. I guess I was curious. I was curious then, as you were saying that. I hear what you're saying. I do. I'm curious then, as a worker, as a spiritual worker yourself, so what's coming to me is that idea of switching between different languages, right? Switching between different kind of cultural paradigms, right? When you're working with rocks and crystals and gemstones, and then go and work with flower essences, what do you need to do to prepare yourself to move from one into the other?
Um,
Now I'm really curious, Nicholas. I
yeah,
just give it to me all, you know.
yeah. So in simplest terms, spirit relationships are spirit relationships. Yes, different orders of the cosmos speak different languages. Like if you want to commune with a star, it feels very different than communing with a grain of sand. But the common factor is getting out of the way. So a recurring conversation I have in Reiki spaces as well, especially when people have maybe not had Reiki training that reflects the roots of it very well, or they've learned varieties that are kind of filled with add-ons that came from outside the system. The biggest thing we do in the practice of Reiki is nothing. And that's hard for especially a Western mind when we live in this consumer world. It's making, doing, you have to be involved in production because that's how capitalism works, right? You have got to have something to show for it. And the practice of spirit, so, spirit with a capital S, spirit with a lowercase s, is an empty practice. And if we grasp too much to form, we lose that inherent spaciousness on the other side of form. So if I want to switch gears from talking to a plant like a mighty oak tree to a tiny little garden weed to a mighty mountain versus this one little Congo citrine, ultimately the process is the same. And it's when we're kind of at the beginning of learning how to do this, it's getting out of the way by means of distraction. Like I'm all for, you don't know how to meditate? Great. Look at how beautiful this rock is. Go examine that flower, count its petals, draw it if you need to, describe it in words. Get your conscious mind so wrapped up around the material thing you're looking at that your subconscious mind has no choice but to open the door to the space of communion. So the mechanics on the outside might look like meditation for me. They might look like sitting there and oohing and awing my newest mineral specimen, or boring rock to someone else's eyes. It might look like getting down on my knees to see what tiny little flower has sprouted in the tall grass that hasn't been mown yet. And while my conscious mind is busy with that, I've been doing this long enough that it doesn't usually require a whole lot more work. It's a waiting game though, because it's a relationship. You can't expect that to happen on your time. Just like with people, you don't stand in the queue at Starbucks, tap someone on their shoulder and say, hi, would you like to be my accountant? Or how about my best friend? You can have your pick. Like, we got to go through the process of getting to know them. Maybe we bump into them in the queue and we start a conversation, which leads to finding out, oh, they're an accountant. Oh, you need one. You exchange information and you work within the parameter of what they do. And you go see them in the office, or if it's virtual, like everything is, you have that Zoom call and you send documents and they do that work. But the magic of getting to know some being, maybe it's the datura in my garden, maybe it's someone's favorite magnolia tree, maybe it's this unidentified weed or rock. When we get to know it in a really intimate way, their CV, their resume isn't the only thing we're limited to. If we truly take the animistic approach and frame what we do around the relationship, then you start to notice that spirits show up for you in ways that are not part of their job class description. Rhodonite is one of my absolute favorite gemstones. Rhodonite shows up for me in ways that rhodonite doesn't appear in my books, because that's not part of its job class description. We just know each other really well. Like, you don't call an accountant when you're going to move to a new house, because they're not movers. You call a mover. But if your best friend happens to be an accountant, they might still help you pack, even though that's not their job, because you're not relying on them for their job in that instance. And that's kind of like my guiding principle when doing this kind of spirit work. It's get out of the way and get to know them. And you got to do that on their terms as much as they're going to do it on your terms. You got to meet somewhere in the middle, because it's just that it's relational.
I really, really resonate with that piece. Part of my discomfort with Canada has been that I've never really felt like it's home. And so I've always felt like I'm just kind of just waiting for a bus in this land. I didn't really feel connected with it. And yet, ironically, one of my favorite stones that I work with is howlite, which is very well known to be to grow in Canada, right? To form part of Canada. And yet there's just something about it that is just so captivating to me. But that took a long time to realize. I just really, there's something about it, right? It's interesting. I feel like a lot of people get lost when they first start to explore spirituality in this way because of that sense of needing it on our time, that getting out of the way and allowing to plug into the relationships that have been happening for millions of years, billions of years on some scales, right? Yeah. Let's change focus then, move on to the last part of our conversation today. We're coming up to time, but I want you to talk a little bit about some of the classes that you're putting together and have going on. You've got quite a lot on offer. So what are some of the things that that are coming up for you?
Thank you for that. This weekend, I'm going to be teaching at Mystic South in Atlanta, Georgia. My talk is called Listen to the Bones of the Land. It's about
Mm.
regional magic and learning how to like tap into the rocks underneath your feet. You're going to notice there's kind of a theme here. Um, so that's fun because I'm bringing with me a box full of like iconic Southern minerals. And I'm also going to talk about a few like notable landforms, but mostly it's like here's what we can learn from igneous rocks, sedimentary rocks, metamorphic rocks, and then go learn from them. I'm not going to give you a textbook definition here. Um, and I've also got a really fun two-part class coming up. This is a topic that I actually first presented at a university, my alma mater, which is really exciting to me. In like 2021 or so, when they started to have space for events again, I went to be a guest speaker at the museum, and the topic is Holy Gems and Healing Crystals, the history of lapidary medicine from the ancient world to today. I love tracing the evolution of ideas, and we have a really long train of ideas that come together in modern crystal healing, and I think we sometimes overplay the role of certain cultures and forget that some people were just really innovative and lived 20 years ago, and that's just as important as what happened 2000 years ago. So we're going to do that in two parts. But I've got a lot coming up. I'm going to be doing some Reiki training in New England, and I'll be at Temple Fest in September, which I'm really excited about. The Northwest Tarot Symposium at the end of September, early October. And I've got plenty of online classes coming up between now and then. In the fall, I'll resume some classes with the College of Psychic Studies with topics like crystals for empaths and highly sensitive people, stones for ancestral healing. I'm doing one that's a two-part class on angelic gemstones, gems used in angelic traditions.
So,
So
question on that is that kind of new age angelic traditions? Is that like Enochian? Give the people a sense of kind of what you mean by that angelic piece.
yeah, a little of column A, a little of column B.
Okay.
I When I approach a topic, I have there's a principle that I follow in all the work that I do, and that I encourage other people to follow, and it's always seek contrary evidence.
Right. Right.
When we're in spiritual spaces, we're dealing with personal gnosis. The Enochian language was someone's personal gnosis, and the whole
Mhm.
system of magic developed out of it was, you know, Edward Kelly and John Dee having a good old time with some spirits, right?
Yes.
And we build huge, huge things off of this little episode in human history. So I think recent episodes in human history should be just as important when we're trying to seek contrary evidence. There's no one single way to do most things in life. You know, ask a witch the one right way to cast a circle. If you have a circle, if you have a group of 10 witches, you're going to get like 45 answers, right?
Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely.
ask a crystal healer how you're supposed to, you know, cleanse a crystal, unblock a chakra, whatever it is that crystal healers do
Mhm.
these days. You don't get a single answer. So that's going to have, um, we're certainly going to pay homage to older traditions. We're going to go back to the roots of angelic and astrological magic, which had a really strong element of gems in it. And then we're also going to look at all the things in between then and now. And I usually attract a pretty broad cross section
So,
in my classes as well,
mm,
since I've got a little of something for everyone. I'm sure there will be some hardcore occultists as well as some love and lighters out there, and I welcome them all because there's space for everybody, and that's something I really try to hold space for in my practice and in my classes, because I've learned from them all, and they've all enriched my life.
I've noticed just in the language you were talking about before, there was Fintorn in there, the Deva spirits, some classical language in there too, and I love that. I love that. I apologize. I interrupted you though.
No, no, you're good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the idea. I think
Mm.
when we deal with abstracts in a relative world, I cannot convey to you an absolute truth because we're obviously subject to it, but we don't operate solely under it. We operate under a relativistic
Absolutely.
mindset. So we have to use relational language instead of absolute, and that often means couching things in metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
So different metaphors for different people, and if I have enough in my toolbox, hopefully I can get the message across.
I'm getting there. I'm getting there. My kind of life journey and my spirituality over the past 20 years has been from those absolutist orthodox kind of mentality to right. Nicholas, this has been wonderful. What's the best way for people to connect with you? I'll put all these links down below, but what's the best way for people to learn more about you and connect with you?
Well, thank you. If anyone is interested in following on social media, I'm at the Luminous Pearl in most places, Instagram, TikTok, now on Threads,
Oh,
um,
perfect.
Facebook, you name it, I've probably tried it. I'm most active on Instagram though, so go follow me there if you want the most stuff. You can also visit my website, which is predictably luminouspearl.com. It's got a calendar of upcoming events, ways to reach out to me. But ultimately, if someone's in an online space and they find me, feel free to say hi, ask a question, leave a comment, drop a DM. I answer as many as I have space for. And sometimes that's all of them, and sometimes it's not. But I always look forward to connecting, collaborating, and supporting others. So thanks for this opportunity to do that with you and your community.
Oh, thank you so much. And actually, a lot of these questions I think will really tie in with the Druid community. You'll notice some of the connections there, and some of them I believe are coming to Mystic South too, so they may actually come and say hi to you. So this is wonderful. Thank you so much, Nicholas. And I actually have forgotten who's next week, so I will post that on Sunday. This summer series has just been going really, really fast and quick, and so I'm losing track of who I'm talking to. I just show up and there they are. So, Nicholas, thank you for coming on the show today and remembering that it was today and not some other day.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And I will post all of those links to Nicholas's social media down below. Check out his work, check out his classes. Every time you post something, they all look amazing. And I'm really looking forward to hanging out with you at some point in the future in person, not just online. But I really appreciate this today. Thank you again.
My pleasure.